This is Y376 International Political Economy, October 7, 2008. The main issues in North-South economic relations are the origins of inequality, the role of international regimes in preserving or increasing inequality, the role of commodity and raw materials trade in preserving or increasing inequality, and import substitution versus export-led growth as strategies for industrial growth in the Third World. This chart shows the growing gap in average incomes among three groups of countries: high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries. This classification has been made by the World Bank. You can see in their World Development Indicators online how these average income has changed between 1980 and 2006. In the high-income countries, the average per capita income is around $35,000 in 2006, about $7,000 in middle-income countries, and around $2,000 in low-income countries. One of the leading theories about inequality at the turn of the 20th century was Hobson's theory of economic imperialism, published by John Hobson in 1910. Hobson was a reformer. He wanted capitalist countries to adopt various kinds of redistributive reforms because he thought that unequal distribution of income combined with capitalism led to surplus production, the search for overseas outlets, the attempt to secure those outlets through imperialism, and finally war among the major capitalist countries over controlling overseas territories. Lenin adopted this theory and changed it slightly to create his theory of imperialism in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, published in 1917, where the unequal distribution of income leads again to war, not because of surplus production, but because of surplus capital. And the war leads to revolution and an overthrow of capitalism. A more recent attempt to understand the origins of inequality came in the 1940s with the work of Argentine economist Raúl Prebisch, who argued that developing countries were subject to a declining terms of trade, which meant that the prices of their exports was declining relative to the price of their imports. Their exports were mainly raw materials and agricultural commodities. Their imports were rather mostly manufactured goods. So the only way for the developing countries to get out of their poverty was to diversify their economies away from raw materials and agricultural commodities. This is the definition of the terms of trade. It's basically you divide some kind of weighted average of the prices of exports by the weighted average of prices of imports. And the argument is that this ratio declines over time. Prebisch argued the reason it would do so because there was more competition among developing countries for export markets in raw materials and commodities than there was among industrialized countries for manufactured goods, that the high population growth rates of developing countries meant that labor was always becoming cheaper in the developing world. There was more supply than there was demand. And in any case, the low bargaining power of developing country unions ensured that wages would be lower there. So the combination of trade that was not producing wealth plus a general trend toward lower wages assured that poverty would continue in the South. Some efforts were made to actually prove that the terms of trade was declining. Prebisch himself did some work, as did Sir Arthur Lewis, a Jamaica-born economist who eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics. And their work did seem to confirm that terms of trade generally trended downward Here's some statistics from 1870 to 1950 in the works of the two individuals. Prebisch recommended the following policies: that there be developing countries attempt to diversify their economies through industrialization using import substitution policies, which I'll explain in a minute, that they engage in regional integration in their regions, that there be more South-South trade and South-South investment flows, that's trade and investment among developing countries, and that there be efforts to control population growth. Import substitution means high tariff barriers on imports of manufactured goods to encourage domestic manufacturing behind the tariff wall. We also call this an infant industry policy, which the U.S. actually had when it was still a young country. Tariff barriers are supposed to be reduced when domestic manufacturers become internationally competitive, and regional integration helps to make that happen by creating a larger market for manufacturers in relatively small countries. Examples of this policy in practice would be in dairy farming in Jamaica, and you'll recall that that's discussed in the film that we're seeing in class called Life and Debt. There's example of the Corporación Venezolana de Guayana, which is an effort to basically replace the foreign oil companies with a domestic oil company there. POSCO, a steel manufacturer in Korea, is a state enterprise created to increase the production of steel in Korea so that other industries would have a domestic source. In Mexico, beer manufacturers like Bohemia and Dos Equis often receive some benefits in the form of higher tariffs against foreign beers. And in Japan, the Japanese government basically threw GM and Ford out in order to create a space for their domestic manufacturers. The Toyota of 1936 is a great example of why that doesn't always work very well. The Toyotas produced by Japanese makers were very expensive, too expensive for most consumers, and their production level was too low to really compete head-to-head with global firms like Ford and GM until after World War II. So here's some of the reasons why import substitution tends to bog down. Basically, the foreign direct investment that comes in order to jump over tariff barriers tends not to add to, but to replace domestic manufacturing. So that's one of the problems with the import substitution strategy, is it just creates an incentive for tariff jumping. But there is some manufacturing that's created, and what manufacturing is created tends to be in light manufacturing, assembly plants, consumer goods, food processing, and so forth. And those industries tend to import capital goods from abroad, machinery, equipment, and raw materials. And so that tends to create a balance of trade deficit, and that can be serious if that continues for very long. As a result, governments often turn to subsidies and state enterprises to encourage the manufacturing of raw materials and machinery, so you tend to have state enterprises in steel, iron and steel, and in other kinds of metalworking industries. So that use of state enterprises and subsidies is called the deepening of import substitution, and it has its own limits. So we have crises of import substitution at a certain point in a variety of countries: Mexico, India, Brazil, Korea, and Taiwan. And you can see some examples of this in the documentary called The Commanding Heights, which you can find if you click through. The answer to the crisis of import substituting industrialization, the bogging down of import substitution, is a strategy called export-led growth. So all export-led growth strategies usually start after a country has adopted some kinds of import substitution. And they begin with a kind of unilateral reduction of tariffs on inputs for manufacturing products that the country thinks it can be successful in exporting. The government also adopts new incentives for exporters, creates export processing zones. It improves infrastructure that allows trade to be as cheap as possible. It provides subsidies for exporting firms, and it may even impose export performance requirements for multinationals that are already operating in their borders. So Japan is the most notable example of success in going from import substitution to export-led growth. It did that successfully after World War II, and it has risen into the ranks of the industrialized countries. The next wave of adopting these strategies was in the four Asian tigers: Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. More recently, we see this happening in Chile, China, and India. China and India are particularly important because of their population. Combined, there are 2.3 billion people. The per capita income of the four Asian tigers rose steadily between 1975 and 2006. As you can see on this chart, the two richer countries are Singapore and Hong Kong, both of them small sort of island republics, whereas larger countries like South Korea and Taiwan have also risen in terms of per capita income, with Korea doing a little bit better than Taiwan, but nevertheless both of them really beginning to look like industrialized countries in terms of their per capita income. China and India have started this process. They are still China is a middle-income country. India is about to become a middle-income country, but the benefits for their entire population have been pretty well documented in books and articles on the consequences of this growth. Both of them have experienced 8 to 10% growth in GDP in the last 10 to 20 years, which tends to trickle down even to the poorest people. This shows the different growth rates at different periods. Even though the poor countries are growing faster than the rich countries at this point, because they start from a lower base, they still haven't quite caught up. One of the responses to the continued existence of absolute poverty, one way to think of this is that there are still a billion people who don't get enough food, don't have adequate shelter, whose kids don't go to school. One of the responses to this was the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals in the United Nations, and you can click through to their site if you go to the URL at the bottom. The main goals are to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve universal primary education, to promote gender equality and empower women, to reduce child mortality, to improve maternal health, to combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, to ensure environmental sustainability, and to develop a global partnership for development.